Hello, and welcome to psy580 Ethical and Professional Conduct in Behavior Analysis. I want to welcome you to this class. I'd like to start by just making sure that you understand this website and that you could use it. The first thing you're going to see is what's new and do, which is a good way to just, if there's something new, it should automatically, I'm told, include what is due here. But if there's something new or something in particular, I will announce it here. There's also a course welcome, and this well, two parts. One, there's an official welcome where I welcome you and a picture of myself that those of you who know me know is quite old. But more importantly, there's also the course organization description. And as you know, this is technically a blended course. Most of the classes weeks are going to be online. There will be two, that is weeks 12 and weeks 14 will be face-to-face classes. Week 12 will be a face-to-face class because we will discuss the readings from week 11 and week 12, which involves punishment. And the reason this is a face-to-face class was feedback from last year's class that really thought that they would have preferred to have a face-to-face opportunity to discuss that. I do want to make sure that you point out, and I know you'll look at the syllabus in more detail, and we'll cover the syllabus in more detail in a minute, and you'll look at it also, but that for week 12, our meeting time is Monday, April 11th. Unfortunately, I had to pick a Monday because people had classes every other day but Friday. So you're going to need to do the readings for the whole week on that Monday. So I apologize. There's going to be a lot of readings between week 11 and week 12, but we will meet on Monday, April 11th. Those meetings will be at 5:30, and they will be in Dion 110. I think I sent everyone an email about that. The other class will be on week 14, and that'll be on Monday, April 25th. Same class, same classroom, same time. And the purpose of that one is, and I'll talk about this in more detail in a minute, but is to talk about the differences and make sure everyone is very clear concerning the differences between the ethical guidelines, which were in place and that this course is focusing on primarily up until this month, and the new ethical code, which replaces them as of January 2016. Now, there aren't substantial differences, and BCBA does a good job of highlighting where those differences are, but I want us to sit down and spend enough time to make sure we're crystal clear. One of the reasons we decided to use the old ethical guidelines is the Bailey and Birch book is not out yet that covers those, and I think they do an excellent job of making this course much more meaningful, and we'll talk more about that in a minute also. So that's why we're doing that. But weeks 12 and weeks 14 will be face-to-face classes. All right, the meat of this is really each week you will see under this weekly content in the left-hand side, the current week will be available to you. So for this first week, starting Monday, the week 1 will be available. You click on that, and you'll see the objectives for that week and the tasks. So, for example, this first week is really just a review of the syllabus, introduction to the class that we're doing now. Your assignments will be to read chapters 1 and 3 of Bailey and Birch, chapter 29 of the Cooper text, watch the narrative PowerPoint, which you're doing right now, so good for you. You're off to a good start. Introduce yourself in the discussion forum, and then there's a short quiz. So there's the objectives, there's the narrated PowerPoint. Then I also included the PowerPoint without the narration for those of you who just want to keep it for yourselves. This first week I included the book, which I think is very important and worth buying, even though it's $42. Because Bailey and Birch really do an excellent job of creating scenarios, ethical dilemmas and scenarios that really help make this course and the ethical guidelines much more understandable for behavior analysts. The feedback that I got on the book was excellent, so that's why I wanted to use this book again this semester. So I highly recommend that you buy the book, and we're certainly going to use it. You're going to be reading 90% of the book for this course. Then you can click on one of the discussion formats to introduce yourself. And here what I want you to do, because not everybody knows each other in this class, I don't think, so is introduce yourself, tell us what experiences you've had in behavior analysis rather, and what your current position is. If it involves behavior analysis, and then share at least one ethical dilemma that you've encountered in the field of applied behavior analysis. Then there's going to be a short quiz, as there will be a quiz or an assignment pretty much every week. And then finally there's the discussion forum, which you can use to ask questions. Or make comments if you have a thought or a comment about something that you think the other students in the class would enjoy or would benefit them. Then I strongly recommend that you post that in the discussion forum, and everybody should I'll look at it every day, but everybody should look at the discussion forum a couple of times a week and then respond to other students if they do say something that is relevant to you. All right, let's go to the syllabus. Which hopefully explains everything in detail, but let me hit the highlights. Okay. So my email address, if you need to contact me, you have technical problems or other kinds of issues that are personal or don't involve the other students or this particular course, just email me. My email address is on the syllabus. I have the required readings, although they are listed each week, and I will include those. And then the course objectives, the communication plan, which I just explained. Use the discussion forum if it has something to do with the course and things that other students would be interested in. Otherwise, use email. And methods of evaluation, well, you can see that 65% of your grade is going to come from these weekly or almost weekly quizzes and assignments. The other 35% of your grade is going to come from discussions. So that's going to be your participation in the discussion forums. And because most of these classes are online, these discussion forums are critical because it's really our only way to communicate. So those are going to be important, as is the 2 in-class discussions that we're going to be having. So that'll be 35% of your grade. I also have included ideas, since participation is an important part of your grade, of exactly concrete suggestions of exactly what I'm looking for in terms of substantial participation. Then the grades. And then finally, each week is broken down into weeks. We will have the week that it starts. As I said, this goes from Monday through Sunday. So the first class, for example, will be on Monday, January 25th, and the assignments are due on Sunday, January 31st. Sunday night, Monday morning, first thing, I will then put up the next week's assignments and activities. The second column here just talks about what the class is going to be. So the first class is online, what we'll be covering, the specific readings, and then the activity, and then how you'll be evaluated. So this first week, there's that short answer quiz, and that will be an evaluation, and also the discussion format of you going into and introducing yourself in the discussion forum. All right, let's move on to the substance of week 1. So this week 1, and this is the PowerPoint. So one, we were going to talk about the organization of the course, which we started doing, but we reviewed the syllabus. And again, I want to repeat, this course is based on the BACB's existing guidelines for responsible conduct for behavior analysts. Now, starting earlier this month, January 1st, 2016, there is a new compliance code. Now, that new code is not radically different from the old guidelines. Really, I think it does a nice job of updating and consolidating the current guidelines in disciplinary standards. However, as I mentioned, I really think that the Bailey and Birch book is critical to making this course most useful and most meaningful for you. And so because their new book based on the code is not going to be out until later this year, and we needed to offer this course, I thought we would try to make the best of this by having this course based on the existing guidelines, and then on the last day of class, that is the week 14, we will sit down and go into detail, although you'll see on the BACB website that the differences, again, are not that substantial, and BACB does a really nice job of breaking out what is new in the new one versus the old one, and we'll look at all of that for week 14, so you will be ready to take the BACB examination that covers the ethical questions. All right. So, just a little introduction into ethics and how we got into it. is, I think all of you, most of you, probably all of you, the applied behavior analysis field that you see is very different than the applied behavior analysis field that I came into, or people older than me came into. Initially, in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s somewhat, people were talking about behavior modification. And basically, the people that were doing applied behavior modification were people who had worked in the lab, which really is my experiences. I got my PhD in experimental psychology. There are people that came from the lab and quickly applied the effects of positive reinforcement and punishment. I mean, heck, we only have two components of applied behavior analysis or behavior modification, reinforcement and punishment, on practical problems, and had great success. So they were taking individuals that were engaging in dangerous behavior, self-injurious behavior, physical aggression, very disruptive behaviors, and they applied what they had learned in the lab, and in many cases produced dramatic changes, which meant the field was exploding during that time. Unfortunately, there were no guidelines there for ethical treatment of individuals. There were no codes, a compliance code. And so people would increase desirable behavior by just using the most potent reinforcers, which works, except they didn't consider that some of the long-term effects of some of those reinforcers, like cigarettes, unhealthy food, of what those long-term effects might be. And it wasn't uncommon to read articles where access to cigarettes were used as reinforcers. And they decreased undesirable behaviors by using punishers. And if the target behavior didn't change, or if the effects were only temporary, they would just use more potent. Sometimes that meant ones that were unhealthy reinforcers or more potent punishers. You also have to keep in mind, again, in those days, there wasn't a focus on training behavior analysts. And in fact, that's one of the biggest focuses in this new code that we will talk about in week 14, that all of you are aware of, is you had to go through this competency-based training to be able to sit for, to get your supervision. So the whole idea of being supervised by a BCBA and having a certain kind of supervision. And now the code is really focusing on what that supervision needs to look like and what are the components of that supervision. Well, back before there were guidelines for compliant behavior in applied behavior analysis, there were also no guidelines for how people were trained. So the backgrounds and training of these behavior modifiers varied. Some were trained as behavior specialists in experimental labs like I was. Others just sort of picked up the craft informally. So the problem is that there were no guidelines about what the target behavior should be. There were no restrictions on the use of reinforcers and punishers. As I mentioned, sometimes the results were very dramatic and positive, but in many cases the results were shocking and horrific abuses of people who could not protect themselves. Bailey and Birch do a really nice job of describing that in whoops, I'm sorry, we lost that. Technical problem. All right. Bailey and Birch do a really nice job of addressing, talking about one of those examples of horrific abuses. And again, these weren't necessarily bad people that were doing these things. They just got so focused. And that's why we need to have courses like this, and we need to have guidelines and codes of what is compliant behavior and what kind of training is necessary. These, in many cases, I find that they were well-intentioned people who weren't talking to anybody else, were working in a vacuum, got so focused on trying to change this behavior in a positive way that they did horrific, illegal, and terrible things. So in any case, Bailey and Birch talk about one example, the Sunland, Miami scandal, in their book. And the take-home point for me is that the efforts by the state of Florida in that example, and then many thoughtful behavior analysts, were really the first, as a result of these abuses that were becoming identified, were the first steps toward a compliance code that we're studying in this class, and the first steps toward important things like peer review. One of the most common themes that we're going to talk about is you need to have other people to talk to. Otherwise, all of us are going to be involved have ethical problems. You need to have someone else to talk to. Peer review committees that ensure that all behavior plans are derived from the literature. People just aren't making stuff up. And outlawing certain forms of reinforcement, unhealthy reinforcers that have negative long-term effects, and certain forms of punishment. All right. I also, having you read a chapter in Bailey and Birch that talks about how behavior analysis is unique. And there are certain aspects that they point out of behavior analysis that I think really are different than what other traditional psychologists might do, or physicians or nurses or pharmacists or other people that also have codes of conduct, professional codes of conduct. And I think it's important to consider those, because that's where a lot of the ethical dilemmas that we're going to read about this week and this semester and discuss this semester come about. One is the wide range of clients. Yeah, we deal with individuals who are typical individuals to people who have severe physical and cognitive deficits. We work with kids, we work with geriatric patients. The biggest one, I think, is unlike most professionals who are treating people directly, in many cases, as behavior analysts, our treatments are conducted by others. We're teaching teachers how to respond to and carry out behavior plans, respond to kids' behaviors and carry out behavior plans. We're teaching parents how to respond to their kids. We're teaching direct care staff how to respond to the individuals that they're serving in their group homes. And so that adds a whole new level to what we do and in how to ensure that we are doing it in an ethical way, and adds a whole new dimension to how things could break down. One of those is that the need for reliable and valid data systems. That's one of the reasons we have to have really good data so we know what's happening, because we may not be seeing that individual every single day. We have to look at the data and someone else is carrying it out. another thing is many of the clients we work with are unable to protect themselves. So we often work with people who have very severe cognitive issues, and so they can't protect themselves, which is even more, I think, lends itself to more potential ethical dilemmas. And finally, behavior analysts are often employed by a third party. So we are employed by an insurance company, and that third party of who is the customer, or if you work for a school district, that's a third party also. And so that brings into into the whole issues of who is the client and who exactly are we working for, and who do we need to talk to in order to make the most ethical and the best decision. All right, I'm also asking you to read a chapter out of Cooper's book. I know you all have the Cooper book. But I think that there's some really good common sense issues that Cooper brings up that I think parallel and support a lot of what Birch and Bailey, which is primarily the book we're going to be using throughout the semester, are talking about. And so Cooper defines ethics as behaviors, practices, decisions that address three fundamental questions. What's the right thing to do? What's worth doing, and what does it mean to be a good behavior analyst? So the first one is, what's the right thing to do? Well, that's going to be based on several things. Your personal experiences, which you can't undo those. Your belief system, and then the professional training and experiences. So that's the part that we can control, is what kind of professional training we're going to be doing. And then to ask that question of what's worth doing, well, what's that based on? Well, it's based on a lot of things. One is some kind of social validity. Are the procedures acceptable? Are they aligned with the best treatment practices? Do they result in meaningful, significant, sustainable change? Looking at cost-benefit ratios, we're going to spend a whole week on cost-benefit ratios. I think this is a very important concept, and we'll talk about it more. But what is the cost, potential cost of an intervention, and what are the benefits? And we need to make those decisions. And the people we need to include are several people. People with the highest stakes in the outcome should have the greatest consideration in helping us make those decisions about, is putting an intervention. I mean, we could all come up with a great complex high-intensity intervention, but what's the cost? What's the cost of that? And I don't mean financial cost. I mean, what are the costs of if people can't implement an intense or complex intervention and they fail? Well, one of them is, for example, is they may inadvertently be reinforcing a higher rate or a higher intensity of the target behavior. So we'll talk more about that. And then finally is, what are some of the existing conditions that are going on? One is that behaviors that are more serious warrant intervention consideration before behaviors that are less serious. And what are the long-term ramifications for treatments that result in quick change? Finally, what is a good behavior analyst? Well, again, some common sense things, but oftentimes when we are confronted with ethical dilemmas, and we all are, Good clinicians, good behavior analysts are confronted with ethical dilemmas every day, and it's how we respond to them. Well, one is the good behavior analyst, according to Cooper, follows the golden rule. So you start with do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think that's a good way to start. That is, gee, would I want someone to be put me on this kind of program? The good behavior analyst is also self-regulating. You have to keep looking at that cost benefit ratio, and when it switches, we need to switch. We have to calibrate decisions over time and determine changing cultural values and contingencies. All right, so this week, your assignments are read chapters 1 and 3 of Bailey and Birch, read chapter 29 of the Cooper text, go into that discussion forum where it says introduce yourself, and state at least one challenging ethical dilemma that you have encountered in functioning as a behavior analyst. We'll come back to that later on in the semester. And then there's the short answer quiz. If you have any questions, as usual, put them in the discussion forum if there's something that would be relevant to most people, or simply email me. Good luck, and I will talk to you soon.